Hi everybody, Shalom, how are you? And it's getting harder and harder to get around this city. You know, where I am, they discontinued like 5 light rail stops for 14 weeks. So I think it's only been 4 weeks, another 10 weeks of it. And now I see Emek Refua is a little messed up. So, you know, it reminds me a little bit of, parents often say they're doing things for their children. So the Kutzker Rebbe said he'd like to meet the last child in history like all of this is being done for. I do it for my kids do it for their kids, but there's some kid at the end. So I'm wondering, all of this great construction, I guess maybe Mashiach, that it'll be... But according to the Rambam, I'm not sure. The Rambam says even when Mashiach comes, the world will still be normal. So that means we're still going to have construction. Even when Mashiach comes, maybe it'll be even worse because Baruch Hashem, there'll be more and more Yidden here, so it'll even be more crowded. But anyway, I don't want to complain. And as always, we are praying for the victory of our Chayolim in all fronts of the war, the lasting unity of Am Yisrael, and prayers for all those whose health has been affected by the war, and of course, the safe return of all the hostages. I'm sure all of you know that Netanyahu is... or was, at least was, I don't know where he is this moment, but was in Washington, and they talk about a ceasefire with return of hostages, and who knows what will be. And Witkoff is going to Qatar to kind of put a little pressure on them. Apparently Qatar could end this in a moment, because they fund, and whatever Hamas funding gets, now that Iran is kind of out of the way, it's Qatar. So all the human political machinations can go this way or that way or that way, but as the Mishnah says, Ein lanu lihisha'en el Avinu shebat shamayim, we can only rely on God to sort it out. Be'ezras Hashem, the hostages should be home very, very, very soon. Refua Shlema, Avraham Mendel, ben Sora Hudel, should have Refua b'soch shar cholei Yisrael. An anonymous contribution again for the Nitzachon of our Chayolim and the hostages, and Hashem's protection for all of Klal Yisrael and for the Geula Shlema. And finally, YIBONEH has so far raised over 80% of the money it needs to purchase 15 more sets of tefillin for our courageous Chayolim who have requested them. Thank you to those who have already donated. And you can contribute via the website and indicate in a memo that the donation is for the Army Tefillin Fund. It is a marvelous, marvelous thing that in response to the great tragedies of October 7, so many Chayolim have wanted to connect to God, particularly through the mitzvah of tzitzis and tefillin. Tefillin is a lot more expensive than tzitzis, so as a result, we obviously need financial assistance to purchase all of the tefillin that are being requested. And if we don't meet the demand, well, unfortunately, Hashem's going to have a big din v'cheshbon on why we didn't provide tefillin for those Chayolim who requested it. So there are a few things. We are in Parshas Balak, and also on Sunday, we have the inauguration, so to speak, of the mourning period for the Beis HaMikdash, beginning the 3 weeks with the 17th of Tammuz. So I'm going to kind of talk about both of those ideas in the shir, kind of mix them up a little bit. But let's start first with the Parsha. We are now in the 40th year. People don't realize, Parshas Chukas, last week's Parsha, transitioned from year 2 to year 40. Because in year 40 is the death of Aaron and the death of Miriam, and the story of Balak. The Jewish people are right on the border of Eretz Yisrael. But once again, they want to pass through Moabite territory. Moab is east of the Jordan, but it's kind of around the southern part of the Dead Sea. So the Jewish people wanted to go through Moabite land to make an entry into Eretz Yisrael instead of having to go all the way around and entering around Yericho, east of Yericho. And as you know, the Moabites did not let them enter, and we were commanded not to conquer Moabite territory because Moab is a descendant of Lot. And just as God made promises to Avraham, God made promises to Lot in the merit of Avraham that their land would be inviolate until the coming of the Mashiach. Okay, so now we read that in this 40th year, the king of Moab, whose name is Balak, is very, very fearful of the Jewish people. And he says they will lap us up, they will swallow us the way an ox consumes the grass of the field. We're frightened of them. This is a nation in which God did many, many miracles for them. So as a result, Balak develops a strategy of hiring a professional curser, a professional sorcerer, whose name is Balaam. And he hires Balaam to curse the Jewish people. And initially, Balaam says, I don't want to do it unless God gives me permission. He's holding out. And whatever it is, after a number of times, God says, go, but don't curse. Say only what I tell you to say. And the overall story, there's a lot of depth in the story, is that 3 times Balaam tries to curse the Jewish people. And every time Balaam tries to curse the Jewish people, Hashem turns his words, what would have been his words of curse, into his words of blessing. Now, there are so many questions about this story. Of course, I didn't even mention Balaam's donkey, the talking donkey. That's also an issue. According to the Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, that was kind of a dream that Balaam had, but Chazal take it as quite literal. But be it as it may, let's start off with a basic question. What is Balak afraid of? God commanded the Jewish people, do not wage war with Moab. And if the Moabites don't let you go through their land, then you got to go around it. Now this already happened. We already requested Moab to go through the land, and when they said no, God said, Al tatzar es Moab, do not wage war with Moab. So if that's the case, why is Balak so scared that Balak wants to hire Balaam to curse Bnei Israel? So there's a beautiful thought from the Shem Mishmuel, the son of the Avnei Nezer, the son of the Sachachaver, but a great Hasidic Rebbe in his own right, where the Shem Mishmuel explains, Balak is not afraid of what the Jewish people will do to his nation. He knows that his nation is safe, but he's afraid of what will happen when the Jewish people come to Eretz Yisrael. In other words, his goal is not self-defense. His goal is to prevent the Jewish people from coming to the land of Israel. He's happy to let them stay in the desert, but not to enter the land of Israel. Why is that? Why is he so concerned about that? Because, and I think this theme has been stated a number of times, Hashem's relationship to the Jewish people in the Midbar is very different than the relationship that's going to be once we arrive in Eretz Yisrael. The Midbar is a type of spiritual cocoon. It's almost an artificial environment. In the Midbar, we get our man from heaven, our bread from heaven, which could taste like whatever you wanted it to taste like. We have our water supply that travels with us. We have clouds of glory that protects us. The presence of God is obvious, open, clear, unmistakable. In spite of the fact that we still committed all those averos, but nevertheless, it's a very open relationship. And we don't have the challenges or distractions of material life. People don't have to go to the office. They don't have to do carpool. They're free. They're panoi. That's why it's so hard to understand how could they commit the averos they committed. But as Rabbi Victor Miller writes over and over again, that was truly the greatest generation. The generation that saw the greatest revelation of divinity ever. So that's the hermetically sealed environment of the desert. Once we come to the land of Israel, our relationship to God is going to radically change. Of course, our nitzachon, our victory, our hatzlacha, our success, is from Hashem. But a lot more of human effort is going to be required. We're not going to get the man min hashamayim. We're going to have to plow and plant and harvest and thresh. We're not going to have a traveling supply of water. We're going to have to dig wells and hope for the rain. We're not going to have clouds of glory. We'll need armies. We'll need the IDF, Chayolim, and the like. Now, here's the thing. As long as the Jews are living a holy life in the desert, that's not necessarily a reproach to the immorality and corruption of the Umot HaOlam. Because they could say, yeah, the Jews serve God because they don't have the problems of real life. But we got a country to run. We have a society to run. We can't afford all of the ruchnius, all of the spirituality, and all of the kedusha. So they're not a role model for the world because the conditions of their life are so radically different. So let them stay in the desert. Let them be an example of a holy nation that's monastic, that are separated from the world. And let them do what they do, because that has nothing to do with us. But once they come to Eretz Yisrael, at least in an ideal way, of course we didn't always live up to that ideal, and we create a society based on Kedusha. We have cities and farms and businesses and armies that are trying to follow the Torah. Again, there are many, many times we haven't realized that picture, but at least in theory. At that point, that is a reproach to all the Umos HaOlam. You see, it is possible to live an ordinary life with all of the problems of society based on holiness and obedience to God. And therefore, the Shem Shmuel argues that it was Balak's intention, let the Jews stay in the desert, because then they become irrelevant to the real affairs of the world, rather than them coming to Eretz Yisrael, where they then become potentially at least, a true Or LaGoyim, a light to the nations, in terms of how do you live in society. Now, the truth of the matter is, this has been a challenge for the state of Israel from the very, very beginning. You know, the first Rav Harashi of the state of Israel was not Rav Kook. Rav Kook died before the state of Israel, but it was Rav Herzog, the grandfather and actually namesake of the present president. Isaac Herzog, Yitzchak Herzog, was the grandfather. Harav Yitzchak Herzog, a great actor. Herzog was an extraordinarily brilliant person. He never went to yeshiva. He learned with his father, and then he's an autodidact. He kind of learned himself, but he was a great master of not only Kol Torah Kula, but also of law. He was also a very great legal mind, and in fact, in one of his books, very fascinating, he wrote a book comparing it's called The Main Institutions of Jewish Law. He actually compares the legal systems of England, which is what he's more familiar with halacha, and he draws the comparisons, contrasts based on Rishonim and Achronim. It's The Main Institutions, only part of which was published. It was supposed to be a 4-volume work. I believe that to date only 2 volumes have been published. But one of Rav Herzog's dreams was he wanted to create a system of how halacha can operate in the confines of a modern state. Because in truth, although everything is in the Torah, this is a very underdeveloped aspect of halacha. You know, halacha, to this very day, deals very comprehensively with all sorts of questions that individuals have. You know, how do I keep Shabbos? How do I keep kosher? What do I do? Even in the army situation. But when you're talking about systems, how do you run, or can you run, an army kahalacha? How do you run a water company? How do you run electricity, police? Now, granted, because of freedom of religion, many of these participants are not going to be from. Okay, but that's their choice, and nobody is talking about kefiyah datit, right? That's not the issue. But theoretically, it would be nice to have in place the halachic guidelines for how all of these things could be accomplished. And that's a very, very difficult project. Rav Herzog created a committee. He wasn't going to do the whole thing himself, in which different people, you handle police, you handle fire, you handle security systems, electric companies, water companies, all of those different things, creating a halachic mechanism for how the Torah could be applied to the complexities of modern society. The project was never completely finished, and of course the problem is, that in either event, the 50s are not the 2025. I mean, even the work that was done does not necessarily address the modern issues. But Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, who was a great, great posek, he died just a few years ago, well into his 90s. So he is known for his multi-volume Shelos Utshuvas Sitz Eliezer, which was always in print. But it's a little less known that back in the 1950s, he authored, under Rav Herzog's guidance, he authored a 3-volume work called Hilchot Medina, the kind of the laws of running a state, in which he tried to address a lot of these issues. Of course, it was back in the 50s. And Hilchot Medina was out of print for many, many years, whatever it would be, because obviously it's a little bit controversial. I mean, number one, if you write Hilchot Medina, you're obviously endorsing the idea of a state, of a Jewish state. Right? So that already was controversial in some segments of the Haredi world. And number two, obviously the halachic rulings will tend to be on the lenient side, simply because of the necessities of the situation, and that was a little controversial. So for many, many years, I had heard of Hilchot Medina because Rav Waldenberg will often refer to it in the Tzitz Eliezer, which is more mainstream. But the Sefer was not available, but lo and behold, around 10 years ago, they finally did reprint it, and in fact, you can get it for free on the wonderful website HebrewBooks.org that I spend most of my day on. Not most of my day, but a lot of my day on. No, it's in Hebrew. It's never been translated. And it's a fascinating work because it has a very ambitious agenda. But again, as I say, it doesn't really end the matter simply because the 1950s is not 2025 and the technologies are different and we kind of need a renewal. So the point I'm making is to go back to the Shem Shmuel. This is what Balak was afraid of. Balak was afraid that the Jewish people would develop a way to show how morality and goodness and Torah are not just ethereal spiritual pursuits of the synagogue or the Beit HaMedrash or the desert, but they are mechanisms by which real life can be lived in real time, and that would be a reproach to the immorality of the Umot HaOlam. And that is what the Shem Shmuel says Balak was very afraid to. Now, the Shem Shmuel, this insight, although I don't think he uses it to answer the question, answers another question that commentaries ask. The Chavetz Chaim asked the question. The Chavetz Chaim says, if Balak is afraid of Bnei Yisrael, why does he hire Balaam to curse Bnei Yisrael? He should hire Balaam to bless him that his armies will be successful. He should have focused on the bracha for his side rather than the klala. So the Chavetz Chaim's answer is, this is the way of Rishaim. They care much more about hurting the other than even helping themselves. A Russia doesn't think in terms of bracha. A Russia thinks of curse. Again, in the case of Hitler, that was very, very apparent. Hitler jeopardized any possibility of Nazi success against the Allies because we got to get rid of the Jews, even if that means, we're taking away resources from fighting the Allied powers, fighting Russia, or whatever it would be. The most important thing is the klala, not the bracha. Of course, with our cousins, the Bnei Yishmael, we see this on a daily basis. What could have been done in Gaza, again, I don't want to get too political, but what the Palestinian people could have created in Gaza, based on what they were given by Israel in Gaza, the gardens and the orchards, the greenhouses, all of the things, they could have made it like, Olam Haba on some level, and it could have been, as they say, the Riviera of the Middle East. Instead, it became a hellhole. Yeah, a lot of the descriptions of the anti-Israel descriptions of Gaza happen to be true. But, how awful it is. Yeah, but the reason it is awful, it's not Israel. It's what they made of it. Once again, it was more important to hurt and destroy Jews than it was to try to create a better way of life. And that's exactly Balaam's thinking, or Balak's thinking. Let's curse the Jews, forget about blessing us. That's the Chafetz Chaim's answer. But the truth is, according to the Shem Mishmuel, you actually have maybe even a more elegant answer. And that is, Balak doesn't need a bracha because Balak is not afraid of the Jewish people attacking him. Balak's agenda is that the Jewish people should not be matzliach to create a religious society in the land of Israel. So if that's the case, he needs the curse. He doesn't need the blessing. He needs the curse. According to the Shem Shmuel, the whole question does not even begin. Okay. Now, the thing about Balaam is a very, very strange character. Rashi brings a Maimer Chazal that says that God had given the Jewish people the greatest of all prophets, Moshe Rabbeinu, and the Umot HaOlam might have had a claim that if you would have given us a person as great as Moshe Rabbeinu, we would be righteous too. So God gave them a prophet who was Balaam, and they still didn't change their ways. Now, l'chora, that's not responsive to the question. The claim is, if you would have given us someone like Moshe Rabbeinu, we would be righteous. So Hashem responds, I gave you Balaam, what do you want? Well, yeah, you gave us Balaam. Balaam is not Moshe. Balaam is an evil guy. So you still haven't addressed the taina that we might have, or that the Umos Olam might have. The answer has to be that both Moshe and Balaam, similar to what we talked about with Korach, but it's just an extension of this, may have started off the same way. It's not that God gave us the righteous person and God gave them an evil person. God gave to both supremely gifted prophets who had a very deep connection with God. If Balaam became evil, it was precisely because of the power that he was given. Imagine, Balaam was given a power that, frankly, from our perspective, just sounds magical. We don't know how it works. He had the power of blessing. He had the power of curse. He would declare that somebody should be destroyed. They would be destroyed. What does that do to a person? A person begins to think they have this infinite power. So the greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu was that although God gave him those powers and those abilities, he remained humble and subservient to the Almighty. And Balaam became consumed with a sense of his greatness, a sense of his power, a sense of his koach. So the Umos HaOlam cannot say, if you would have given us a Moshe Rabbeinu, we would have been better. He says, I gave you somebody who could have become Moshe Rabbeinu. And listen, Moshe could have become Balaam. It was all a function of human choice. That's not God's doing. That's how the human being responds to the situation they're in. So we have to recognize that Balaam, on some level, was an extraordinarily great prophet. A prophet who Chazal say was considered to be equal in prophecy and vision and even miraculous powers to Moshe Rabbeinu himself. And yet, Balaam made choices. Balaam became changed by the powers that he was given. Became changed to the worst. Now, the Gemara in Brachos says a very fascinating thing. What was the source of Balaam's unusual power to curse? What was his source? So this is a Gemara in Brachos. The Gemara in Brachos says there's a certain fraction of a second every day when God has tremendous fury in the world. And if you can put in your curse at the moment of that fury, it's like Hashem makes the atomic bomb button available for a fraction of a second. If you can push it that second, you got it. Balaam knew, this is in Aramaic, it's called Idan. Idan is the same as Zaman. Idan Rischa. That just means a Zaman of anger. And Chazal quote the pasuk in Tehillim that we say in davening every day, Mizmor Shir Chanukah Tabayis LaDavid, Ki Rega Biapo. God's anger is Rega. A Rega, a moment. And how long is a moment? So the Gemara says, Kememre. The amount of time it says to say the word Rega is a Rega. So it's not a second, it's not a minute, it's Rega. I don't have a stopwatch, but whatever Rega is the amount of time. And Balaam knew, L'chaven et hasha'ah. And that's why his curse was always effective. Now, the Gemara tells us that the great Rabbi Meir had enemies, and he wanted to curse those enemies. And he wanted to pronounce his curse during that time of Idan Rischa. And there was a tradition that how do you know when the Idan Rischa is? So it's mentioned, of course it's such a short time. It's when the red comb of the rooster turns white for a fraction of a second. Like white with fright. Right? That's the Rega. So it says Rav Meir tied a rooster to his bedpost, and he sat down to stare at the rooster to try to see when the color changed. Now, the truth is I really don't get this, because blinking already, I think you'd miss the opportunity, but maybe he thought he would be lucky and he would see it at a time when he wasn't blinking. And what happened was, he fell asleep, and then he recognized this is not the right derech to go. And of course, remember, this fits very well with another story about Rabbi Meir. It might be the same enemies, where Rabbi Meir wanted to curse his enemies that they should die, and his very wise wife, Broria, told him that's not correct, because David HaMelech said, Yitamu chatoim min haaretz, sins, averot, sins should be destroyed, and then you don't have Rishayim. Don't pray for the destruction of the Rasha. Pray for the destruction of the evil, so that the Rasha does tshuva. That's what one should do. So it ties in. You see, both stories. I mean, they're recorded as two different stories that are separated by a lot of pages, but it seems to be almost the same story. He first wanted to curse them with Idan Rischa. He was not matzliach in that. And then he was just going to curse them generally, and Broria, his wife, told him that that's not the right way to do it. Okay. Now, Tosfos, in Maseches Brachos, asks a very, very good question. And that is, given the fact that this is only a fraction of a second, what curse could Balaam say that would be within his window? The window is so small. You tell me, Balaam is successful in cursing because he put in his curse in the time of anger. But the time of anger is a fraction of a second. What can you say? So Tosfos gives two answers. One answer is, as long as you start your curse in the window, it's like you enter a store, right? A bank that way. The bank closes at 1. But if you manage to get into the lobby, you're in the bank before 1, so they'll handle with you, right? But nobody new can come in. So it's the same thing. As long as you got your curse, you began your curse when the window was open, God will take it. By the way, some actually draw a halachic conclusion from this, a very halachic conclusion. We know that for mitzvos like Kriya Shema and Tefillah, Shemona Esrei, there are zamanim. You got to do it by a certain time. So, for example, the recitation of Shema must be said within the first quarter of the day. So in a 12-hour day, that means before the expiration of 3 hours. In a 12-hour day, but these are or 3 halachic hours, meaning 1/4 of the daylight hours. The Amidah must be said before the middle of the day, before Chatzos. After Chatzos, if you missed Chatzos and you didn't daven Shachris, you didn't daven the Amidah of Shachris, you can't do it anymore. If you weren't totally negligent, you can daven 2 minchas as a makeup, but you cannot daven Shachris. And of course, keep in mind, mincha cannot be davened until a half an hour after Chatzos. So therefore, the period between Chatzos and mincha is no man's land. You can't daven Shachris, you cannot daven mincha. Now, what is the halacha if I started davening, let's say the Amidah, 2 minutes before Chatzos? Am I allowed to finish it? Or what if I started Kriya Shema before the expiration? So some want to make a kal v'chomer. Since we know that God is much more generous on good things than He's punishing on negative things, so if even for a curse, God says, as long as you begin it in the right time, you can finish it, kal v'chomer, for shi'arai, for good things, like Kriya Shema and davening. So this was a justification of some Hasidic Rebbes, that as long as they began Shema in the proper time, they could finish it after the proper time. As long as they began the Amidah in the proper time, they could finish it. But of course, even if you accept that answer, that only works if you started before the... if you're starting it after the time expires, you're going to have to come up with another answer for that. Okay, that'll be a talk for another time. So that's answer number 1 that Tosfos gives. But answer number 2 that Tosfos gives is Balaam was able to devise a curse that would work even in that small window. Remember, the small window is the amount of time it takes to say the word rega. Rega is a 2-syllable word. So Balaam came up with a 2-syllable curse. And that 2-syllable curse is the word kalem. Kalem with a chaf. Kalem. Kalem means destroy them. Kalem has the same number of syllables as rega, so memela, he could have gotten it in. And therefore, although Balaam's brachos are much longer, but when Balaam would curse other nations or whatever it would be, he would use the kalem formula and tap into that time of anger and be able to destroy. Okay, so these are the 2 answers of Tosfos. One is, as long as Balaam began his curse, he could finish it. The other is, he had a 2-syllable curse that he was able to coordinate exactly with the Idan Ritzcha, the time of anger. Now, there is a Chassam Sofer that elaborates a little bit on this idea of Tosfos. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit on the Chassam Sofer. I'm going to be adding some stuff to the Chassam Sofer. And that is, Pirkei Avos describes a contrast between the Talmidim, the disciples of Avraham Avinu, those who follow the ways of Avraham Avinu, might even be non-Jews. In other words, people who follow the ways of Avraham Avinu, versus those who follow the ways of Balaam. And it mentions the 3 characteristics of the students of Avraham Avinu. And again, as I say, this could even be non-Jews. Is ayin tova, a good eye. A good eye is not referring to a 20/20 vision. A good eye really means a generosity of spirit. Like the Yiddish word fargin, meaning when good things happen to people, instead of being jealous or angry, envious, you get a pleasure in other people's joy. That's what an ayin tova means. Ayin tova means I get pleasure in the good things that happen to people. That's a beautiful midah, actually. And in fact, Rav Meir Simcha writes, it is harder to get pleasure in somebody's joy than to commiserate in their sorrow. Now, commiserating in sorrow is also a very powerful, beautiful midah. That is called nosei bi'ol es chavera, meaning I feel your pain, I bear your pain with you. That's a wonderful midah. That is an absolutely wonderful midah, to have empathy and feel the pain and suffering that somebody's going through. But Rav Meir Simcha says, as beautiful as bearing the yoke of someone's pain is, rejoicing in their simcha is even harder, because there's always a tinge of jealousy or why not me? Now I remember my son, who now is almost 40, but when he was in second grade, so they had they have like schools have. They have a Shabbos. It was a co-ed school, forgive me, but a co-ed school, and they have a Shabbos party and a Shabbos Ava and a Shabbos Ima, and everything else. And at the end, they give some award to the best student of the week. So I remember my son came home one Friday, and he was so happy. He was so excited because he said, Mayor, his best friend was Mayor, still his best friend. Mayor got the best, best Abba of the Week award or something. So I was thinking, as a cynical adult, I didn't say, I wouldn't say it. I said, "What are you so happy about? It wasn't you." But then I said, what a beautiful midah. That is, quite literally, I saw that he was just as happy, just as excited that his friend got it as it would be for himself. That's not an easy midah, because jealousy, even of people that you love a lot, people that you care about. They say with dieting, this is a problem. Let's say you have a bunch of overweight friends, and they get together and they enjoy each other's company, and one really, really decides they want to lose weight, and they're disciplined and they really work at it, and they're very successful. Their friends, in subtle ways, might try to sabotage the success a little bit by saying, "Oh, you look so emaciated, have some cake, what do you want?" And it's complicated. I don't mean to accuse any. It's a complicated dynamic in which we sometimes suffer a little bit when people are achieving some successes in certain aspects that we haven't achieved. All right. I don't want to be marich, but that's kind of the general idea. So ayin tova is the opposite midah of that. Ayin tova is when you get pleasure in the successes of others. The second midah of Avraham Avinu is ruach nemucha. Ruach nemucha is really modesty, humility, humbleness. A lowly spirit. Again, God forbid, not self-loathing or depression, but you're humble. In a way, it's kind of connected. That's why you can have an ayin tova. You're humble. And the third midah is nefesh shefala, which means a lowly soul, but that's interpreted as you're not lahut, meaning you're not overly hedonistic for pleasures. You're happy with a simple life. So the three midas are ayin tova, generosity of spirit, humility, and kind of a simplicity in terms of what you want out of life. You don't have so many demands. Balaam is exactly the opposite in every single one. The attributes of the Talmidim of Balaam is ayin ra'ah, an evil eye. Someone's successful, I kind of resent it. Ruach gavaya, arrogance, hubris. And nefesh rechava, a hedonist. Right, as Rashi points out, when Balaam initially refused to go, he was hinting at what really might appeal to him. He says, "Even if you give me a house full of gold and silver, I'm not going to go." But he's kind of dropping a hint. The gold and the silver, maybe you can make some type of imprint there. So, in many, many ways, The Chassam Sofer says, Balaam, like Korach, is a similar thought, but coming from a different place, is what we might call a tragic figure. Under Aristotle's definition of tragedy, that's why we call it Greek tragedy, it comes from Aristotle. Tragedy is not if a house simply falls on somebody. That's a very sad event. Tragedy is not what happens from the outside. Tragedy is when a great person, or a potentially great person, is destroyed because of a flaw that is within him. That's tragic. That awakens very powerful emotions in an observer or a listener or a reader, because you see a person who is so gifted, so potentially great, so many talents, and they get destroyed from within. Unfortunately, even in the Torah community, we've seen examples. I don't want to mention any names at all, but people who are very gifted, either in teaching or in writing, people who are influences for good, but they got destroyed because of demons, flaws, sins, whatever you want to call it, within, in terms of sexual abuse or pedophilia, whatever it might be. But it's tragic. I get in trouble for this sometimes. Obviously, it's tragic for the victims, and the victims have the greatest claim on our compassion. I mean, that's so obvious that it doesn't have to be said, but I have to say it, otherwise I will be accused of not saying it. But the point I want to make here is that there's a tragedy not only in terms of the victims, there's a tragedy in terms of the perpetrator, because the perpetrator was not some crazy wild animal. The perpetrator was someone with talent, with abilities, with potential. And that was all destroyed because of those very bad, very evil decisions. So there's tragedies on both sides of this. So in that sense, Balaam was a tragic figure, because he was a prophet as great as Moshe, in terms of insight, in terms of power of blessing, power of curse. And yet, Balaam was consumed by the inner demons of Ayin Ra, jealousy, Ruach Gavoa, arrogance, Nefesh Rechava, hedonism. By the way, this corresponds, Pirkei Avos calls these very three midos by a different name in another Mishnah. This is Kina, Taiva, V'Kavod. Remember, there's a famous Mishnah that says jealousy, lust, and seeking honor take a person out of the world. Now, if you think about this, these are direct synonyms, although different lashon, direct synonyms of the three negative midos of Balaam. So, Ayin Ra'ah corresponds to jealousy. Ruach Gavoa, arrogance, corresponds to kavod. Nefesh Rechava, which is hedonism, corresponds to taiva. So, why the Mishnah employs different, of course there are different rabbis who are speaking, why different rabbis employ different vocabularies is actually an interesting question for in-depth study, but in simplest meaning, these are synonymous terms. So the three attributes of Balaam, in a negative sense, correspond to kina, taiva, v'kava. So now, the Chassam Sofer says the following. If Balaam wants to curse the Jewish people, maybe the greatest, or curse anybody, maybe the greatest curse he could give is, may you be like me. Because Balaam is tortured. How does a person feel? See, Balaam was smart enough not to be oblivious of his situation, meaning sometimes, a person is so unself-aware that he may have all of these negative attributes, but he doesn't even look at them as negative, doesn't realize. Balaam was cursed by virtue of his prophetic insight, that Balaam knew exactly the tragedy of his very existence. Balaam was aware of his abilities, was aware of his talents, and used those talents in sometimes destructive ways. But he was also aware of the tragedy within him, the train wreck within him. So the biggest curse he could give, the worst curse he would say is, may you be like me. May your gifts be sabotaged by flaws. So here's what the Chassam Sofer says. Again, I'm adding quite a lot to it, but his bottom line is, kalem, destroy them, can actually be an abbreviation of 3 words. Koloyot, kidneys. Lamed is lave. And mem is moach, mind. That's a curse. Now, why is that a curse? We know that kidneys, in ways that may not match with medical science necessarily, but were understood in the ancient world as a source of passion, particularly sexual passion. So kidneys refers to powerful lusts. Lave is generally emotions, including resentments. Moach, brain, is the intellectual and moral sensibility that a person has. Kalem is when your mind is subordinate to your passions and your emotions. You use your mind to further your baser instincts. And that is inner destruction. That is kalem. Think about the world today. You know, if you think about, let's say, the whole area of mass entertainment, the guys who make movies. Now, these are smart people. I mean, the special effects, the scripts, even the financial aspects. These are brilliant, brilliant minds in many, many ways. A lot of them are Jewish, but whatever. And yet, they're using their minds to play on emotions and baser instincts and the like. The mind gets hijacked to service the passions. And that is inner destruction. So Balaam's curse is, be like me. Now, the opposite, let's take the words kalem. The opposite of kalem is melech. Melech stands for moach, the mind, lev, the emotions, and the chaf is the klayot, the passions. Meaning, what is a melech? A melech is when your emotions and passions are guided and directed and led by your intellectual and moral capacities. That is the meaning of a king, right? A king is not someone who rules over other people. A true king is a person who rules over himself. Pirkei Avos says, Ezehu Gibor, who is a true hero? HaKovesh es Yitzro. He conquers, he subjugates the Yetzer Hara. And the source of that is a pasuk in Mishlei that says, Umoshel Barucho, Miloched Ir. He who rules over his spirit is greater than he who conquers a city. The Chovos HaLevavos brings a parable about a victorious general who came back after a big war, and there was like a parade welcoming him back. Right? They would, just like they have ticker tape parades when MacArthur came back, whatever it is, but they had, in the ancient world, there was a triumphal entry of the general. And as the general was basking in all of the accolades, a wise man whispered to him, "Welcome back from the small war. And now you have to face the great war." The small war was the war you waged against the enemy. The big war is the war you have to wage within yourself. That's much tougher. In fact, I think Rabbi Steinsaltz, Zichrono Livracha, once said, this was many, many years ago, I think he was actually a very young man, this may go back to the early 60s, but I saw the statement somewhere, that he said that maybe the reason people are so interested in exploring outer space is because inner space is too scary. I'd rather not look into my inner space, right? The Chalal Chitzoni is easier to look at than the Chalal Panimi. And that's kind of what it is. Some Sefer says, when God changed Balaam's curses into blessings, the word Melech appears so often in Balaam's curses, because quite literally, Balaam wanted to say Kalem, and God reversed it. He blessed them with Melech. Now, I do want to clarify one little thing, because there might be a misunderstanding here. So on one hand, we said, what is a melech? A melech is where the moach, the intellect and the morality, rule over the passions and the emotions. Now, that could be misunderstood a little bit. That could be misunderstood as that Judaism does not look at emotions and feelings as important. We want you to be an automaton and do what is right and totally disregard your feelings and emotions. That's not exactly what it means. For example, the Baal Tanya writes many, many times in Tanya, without using this drasha of Kalem, he doesn't make this drasha, but he says, Hamoach sholet al halev. The Baal Tanya writes this explicitly. The mind has the capacity to control the heart, which is exactly the Chazam Sofer's word about Melech. What does it mean, though? The mind rules over the heart. There's a superficial meaning and there's a deeper meaning. There is a superficial meaning, which is also true, and that is, even if my emotions want to do something bad, my mind has the power to override it. Okay, and that is true. But that's on a lower level. That's a lower and more superficial level, in which you're using your mind to restrain the expression of your emotions. And sometimes that is necessary. You want to murder somebody, well, your mind has to control you and say, don't do it. But the Baal Tanya is saying there's a much deeper meaning, and that is the emotions themselves become transformed by deep thinking and meditation. The Baal Tanya believed, and that's why, by the way, Lubavitch Hasidus is called Chabad. I mean, the name Chabad, Hasidus of Chabad, was the actual term of the Alter Rebbe himself, the Baal Tanya, the first founder of this Hasidus. He was never in Lubavitch, so it wasn't called Lubavitch. Lubavitch became their place later. But he called it Chabad because Chabad is Chachma Bina V'das, and he believed that the mind has the ability to transform your emotions into emotions of love and joy and reverence of Hashem. Meaning, we tend to look at emotions as free agents. They're just kind of there. He says, no, your emotions can also be redirected. So the point is not to squish and contain your emotions, although in the short term that might be necessary. The point ultimately is to transform your emotions. And lahavdil, modern psychology actually talks quite a lot about this. Modern psychology, a lot of modalities of therapy are about re-educating your emotional responses to things. Instead of controlling them, which can work in the short term, but ultimately it often doesn't work, because eventually, like a pressure cooker, you explode. You kind of reframe your situations so your emotional responses are going to be different. Okay, so that is kind of the lessons that we get from the story of Balak. Again, when I say over these shiurim, I feel so much compassion for Korach, because we said somewhat of a similar thought with Korach, and now with Balaam, because the idea of greatness that has that tragic flaw is truly, Aristotle was right, that truly is a tragedy. Because there was so much potential. There was so much good. So much could have been accomplished. And yet, a person gets destroyed, not by the outside enemy. A person gets destroyed by the demons within. And we have to find ways of using the moach, meaning our mental and moral faculties, to try to redefine those emotions so they could be channeled in very, very good and positive ways. We are finished, but just to give me a few minutes. So I'm not going to say a whole share, obviously, on Shivas or Tammuz, but I want to just point out some interesting, maybe side things, but that people often don't realize. The Mishnah tells us, the Mishnah Maseches Taanis tells us, that the fast day of the 17th of Tammuz was ordained because of 5 different tragedies that happened on the 17th of Tammuz. 5 tragedies happened on the 9th of Av, and 5 tragedies happened on the 17th of Tammuz. I just want to enumerate the 5 tragedies and point out some observations about them. Tragedy number 1 is that the 17th of Tammuz was the 40th day from Shavuos, when Moshe came down from Har Sinai with the luchos, the first tablets. And what was he confronted with? He was confronted with the Jewish people, or some of them, worshiping the golden calf. And on the 17th of Tammuz, the luchos, the first tablets, were shattered. That was a great, great tragedy. God wanted to destroy the Jewish people. Moshe prayed, and by Yom Kippur we got the second luchos. But Shivas or Tammuz was the tragedy of losing the Torah. And there was no guarantee at the time we would get it back. That's tragedy number 1. Tragedy number 2 is that the 17th of Tammuz was the day that the Romans, this is the second temple already, who were besieging Yerushalayim, were able to break through the wall. And of course the temple was destroyed 3 weeks later on the 9th of Av. So that's called Hufka'a Ha'ir. And the Gemara in Taanis actually points out that in the first Beis HaMikdash, the Babylonians broke through the wall on the 9th of Tammuz. So why do I do the 17th? So one answer is that we go with the latest tragedy. And why don't I do both? Because it would have been too difficult to fast on the 9th and on the 17th. Okay, so Hufka Ha'ir is connected to the second temple. Now, the third tragedy is Batel HaTamid. The Korban Tamid is the daily offering that is brought every single day, Shabbos, Yom Kippur, every day of the year, in the morning and in the late afternoon. And the Tamid was discontinued on the 17th of Tammuz. Now, this is a point I want to focus on a little bit, because it really is not clear exactly what that means. Most people understand it to mean, and for many years that's how I understood it, that it basically means that 3 weeks after the Romans broke in, for the next 3 weeks, even though the temple was still standing, they were not really able to bring the Korban Tamid anymore. Which means, in other words, the Batel Tamid is referring to what happened in the last 3 weeks before the destruction of the temple. That's Batel Tamid. It's connected, Hufka Ha'ir Batel Tamid. And yet, Rashi in the book of Daniel, explaining Daniel's visions, actually says that they stopped bringing the Tamid more than 3 years before the destruction of the temple. Which means, at least according to Rashi, the Shivas or Tammuz of Batel HaTamid is not referring to the Shivas or Tammuz when the siege was broken, but during the siege, we couldn't get animals or whatever it is, and we stopped bringing the Tamid. Now, I don't think Rashi means necessarily that they never brought the Tamid for the last 3 years. It just meant it was no longer daily. Batel HaTamid, in other words, Batel HaTamid doesn't mean the Tamid ceased. It could mean it was no longer Tamid, meaning the last 3 years it was sporadic. So I'm bringing this out just as a point of information that a lot of people don't know this, meaning a lot of people assume Batel HaTamid is the permanent cessation of the Tamid in the last 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av, when according to Rashi and Daniel it refers to something that happened 3 years earlier, and it doesn't mean total cessation, but it meant it was no longer on a daily basis. Okay. The fourth tragedy is Saraf Apustamus Esatira. Apustamus is somebody, that's part of the mystery, who on earth is he? He burnt the Sefer Torah on the 17th of Tammuz, ergo became a fast. Now, this fourth one is a little difficult to understand. First of all, who was Apustamus and when did he do it? First temple, second temple, time of Antiochus. But second of all, burning a Sefer Torah is a tragedy. But many Sifrei Torah have been burnt. To make a tainus because Apustamus burnt a Torah, well, in the Holocaust, how many, God forbid, how many Torahs were burnt? So why would this be unique enough that this would be part of why you have a fast? So some say the following. I'll give you two very fascinating explanations. Some say that when it says he burnt the Torah, it was a very, very special Torah. It was the Torah written by Ezra. We didn't have the Torah of Moshe anymore. That was hidden with the ark. But Ezra, who was like Moshe, wrote a Torah, and that was the official text that was used. And he burnt the Sefer Torah of Ezra, which would be a very significant thing. But I'll tell you a pshat that a Hungarian Rav came up with 50 years ago. Very creative. This was a Hungarian Rav who was also a historian, not just a Rav, but he was into ancient history. He identified Apustamus as Pompey. Now here you need to know a little history. The temple was not destroyed until the year 70 of the Common Era. But the Romans had conquered the land of Israel many years before, 63 BCE. So 63 plus 70 is whatever number of years that is. And Pompey did it. Pompey was the Roman general who, without authorization from Rome, on his own, just decided to enter. Of course, he entered on invitation because at that point you had two Hasmonean brothers who were arguing over the kingship, and one brother invited Pompey to help him. Not a good sign, because Pompey then used it as an excuse to simply take over. So Apustamus doesn't sound like Pompey, but he says it's close enough to Pompey that somehow names get corrupted. And when it says he burnt the Torah, listen to this very creative interpretation. The first decree that Pompey issued was that the law of the land shall be Roman law rather than Torah law. So in a symbolic way, it's very symbolic, he burnt the Torah is not referring to a Torah scroll being burnt, It's referring to a symbolic burning of the Torah by having secular law replace the law of the Torah. And that became indeed an element of tragedy. And it is earlier, meaning this is actually earlier than Hufka Ha'ir. Hufka Ha'ir and Batal HaTamid are closer to the Chorban Beis HaMikdash. Saraf Apustimus HaTorah is earlier. It goes back to 63 BCE. And the final, again, this is a chiddush. There's not a clear source for this, but this historian, this Rav, tried to construct this. And the final thing that happened on the 17th of Tammuz was an idol, a tselem, an idol, was erected in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, when, where, how do we know this? Some say it actually connects to Menashe. In Tanakh, it says Menashe put in. In other words, it's not referring to the destruction of the temple. It goes back to the king Menashe. Because the problem is, the most famous event we have during Roman occupation of an idol being put on the temple was an attempt to do so, which was not carried out. Caligula, who was a pretty bad guy, also a crazy guy, so maybe that's a mitigating circumstance. In fact, what did he do? The story goes he made his horse assistant emperor or vice emperor or something. Whatever, he was a Meshuggah. But Meshuggahs can be dangerous when they're the Roman emperor. So Caligula demanded that the Jews erect a statue of him in the Beis HaMikdash. This was a demand, and he was going to, murder Jews if they didn't carry out his demand. And Josephus records that the Jews refused to give in. They stood by their guns. They were prepared to fight the Roman troops over this principle. And for various reasons, the procurator, the governor of Judea, somehow convinced Caligula to this is not the right time or place for this. So it's a little schwer to say Humad Tselem Behechal is referring to something the Romans did, because the only event that we know of the Romans doing that was an attempt, and the attempt was not carried out. The words Humad Tselem Behechal implies that it actually happened. So because of this, many Meforshim say it is not referring to the Romans, it's not referring to the period of the destruction of the temple. It goes back to the biblical period in the Sefer Malachim, in which it is recorded, indeed it is recorded, that there were Jewish kings, so this is not an enemy here, Jewish kings who put up idols in the Beis HaMikdash. The point I'm making is that you take a list like this, and it's very unclear. Just to contrast it, the 5 events of Tisha B'Av, which I don't want to talk about now, we're running late, are actually very, very clear. There's a precise identification. Chorban Bayis Rishon, Chorban Bayis Sheni, Chet HaMeraglim, fall of Beitar, Yerushalayim being plowed over. Those are very, very clearly identified events. It is interesting that the 5 events of the 17th of Tammuz, at least 3 of them, Hufka, 2 of them basically, Saraf Apustimus as Torah, and Humad Tselem Behechal, and even the 3rd, Batal HaTamid. Right, so 3 of the 5 are a little ambiguous. The only 2 that are clear are Nishtabru Haluchos and Hufka Ha'ir. Those 2 are clear. The other 3, it is actually not very clear what they're referring to. So that actually is, I thought that's very interesting that when you try to match up the Mishnah to the actual historical events. Be it as it may, the Navi Zechariah tells us that all of these fast days, including the 9th of Av, shall become not only not fast days, but when the Geula comes, there will be days of rejoicing and simcha. So the bracha is, it could still happen, that my bracha is that you should not have to fast on the 17th of Tammuz, not because of health reasons, but because we should be zocha to the Geula Shlema. If chas v'shalom we still have to fast, may it be a meaningful, inspirational tainus that does bring us closer to the ultimate Geula. Thank you.
YIBONEH Shir Chadai